and you have joined us for our Speaking About Pedagogy and Practice lecture series. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and I hope that you're as excited as I am. For those who are new to the online presentation format, I do want to share a few quick tips that were shared with me. First of all, if you've called in by phone, you may want to know that this is not a toll-free number. And so we do recommend that you use the mic and speakers option in the control bar so that you can listen toll-free through your computer speakers. Second point of interest is that you may have noticed that your line is muted, and that's just simply so that we can minimize background noise and other interruptions during Bruce's presentation. We do want you to ask questions and participate as you wish, but we would like for you to do so in writing. So you may notice that the box marked questions on the right-hand side of your screen in the webinar dashboard is there for you to type in any comments or questions you may have during the presentation. If your dashboard seems to have disappeared, then you might see a little orange arrow. If you click that, it should pop back up. You can send in your questions or comments at any time, and we'll probably hold most of those until closer to the end of Bruce's presentation. And when the formal presentation is over, we'll use that remaining time to answer as many of your questions or allow Bruce to reflect on your comments with the time that's remaining. And if we happen to run out of time and your question or comment doesn't get directly referenced, then I'll be sure to forward those to Bruce so that he can connect with you in a meaningful way offline. All right, just a couple of other things, and then we'll get started. First, it is just sort of some blatant advertising here. We'd love for you to follow us on Twitter, and if you're one of those people who likes to sort of live tweet, then please use the hashtag PearsonLearn, and you can follow us at Pearson North AM from North America. All right, I'm just completely honored to be able to introduce Bruce today. Bruce Ballenger. He comes from the University of Idaho. And the title of his session is The Power of Narrative Thinking. This is what Bruce has written, and I'll just sort of quickly read this for you. We typically think of narrative as a structure, a way of organizing information based on experience. Narrative is not the go-to structure for organizing material for, say, research-based writing. We assume that kind of writing should use logical structures built on the thesis-proof model. Reason, not narrative, is the organizing principle for academic writing. Yet if we begin to see narrative as a mode of thinking rather than a structure, it becomes obvious that it is a powerful and common method for discovery. Narrative is also an essential element of reporting findings, and so this talk is going to examine the role of narrative thinking and writing in research. Bruce is the author of 7 books, including 2 best-selling composition texts, The Curious Writer and The Curious Researcher. Both books I used when I was a teacher at the University of New Orleans, which is where I fell in love with Bruce and his ideas. As I mentioned before, I said University of Idaho, Bruce, I misspoke. It's Boise State University. I'm sure he would have corrected me on that. He teaches courses in creative nonfiction, comp theory, and, of course, inquiry-based learning. All right, Bruce, it's time to turn it over to you. Are you ready to get started?
I am. Thank you, Allie. Let me just get my PowerPoint here up so everyone can see it. How are we doing? Is that visible?
There it is.
Okay, good. All right. I am just delighted to be here, and thank you, Allie, for that generous and gracious introduction. I've worked with you down at UNO on a number of occasions, and Pearson is lucky to have you. This is a talk about the power of narrative thinking, and as I was beginning to think about how I would talk about this, I thought, well, it's appropriate that I make this a story. And so that's my intention. For the next few minutes, I'll just kind of tell you the story of how my thinking about narrative has evolved in the last few months, actually, and hopefully that will provide a way of, will spark some interesting conversation at the end of my talk. First of all, the story begins, of course, with a series of incidents, of events. None of these are very dramatic, but they certainly had an impact on me. And there was really three of them. And the first was I was earlier in the fall reading a new book by Tom Newkirk called Minds Made for Stories. And Tom is just a preeminent scholar in composition studies, but he also happens to be, he was my dissertation director and also happens to be a really good friend. And my thinking has just been profoundly influenced by Tom and the work he's done. But anyway, I was reading this book, which I think makes a really persuasive argument that that narrative is an element, not just of storytelling, of writing about experience, but of expository work, of writing persuasive and research writing. And at the same time, I was teaching two classes. One was a first-year writing class, and the other was a creative nonfiction class. And in both of those classes, we were spending some time talking about how to make research writing interesting, you know, all the kinds of things I think that is a major emphasis of some of my textbooks. And then the next day, after I sort of finished Tom's book, I walked into my class and I did an exercise with the students that uses the Harper's Index. And I don't know, I've been enamored with the Harper's Index for a long time. I love, for one thing, I love the way the index, which is, you probably all know, is a monthly feature in Harper's Magazine that has a series of sort of factoids that are based on data that they've collected about politics, about relationships, and a whole range of topics. And they're often listed one after the other, maybe a clump of three, and those often tell an interesting story. And so one of the things I do at the Harper's Index in my composition classes, and actually in my creative nonfiction classes as well, is that I get students into groups and give them a packet of 60 of these things. And on your screen you can see sort of an example of these business cards that I've sort of printed up with all these facts. And the facts, as I said, can range from stuff about relationships to about race, education. Some of them are pretty amusing, like percentage of Americans who say they're willing to have an internet access device implanted in their brains, 10%. Oh, here's one. Percent increase in 1982 in the portion of U.S. college students with a problematic level of narcissism, 60. So it's the kind of stuff that's really provocative to students. So that day I got students in the group, gave each group a packet of 60 cards, not arranged in any particular order, and my request was simply to find an organizing logic for all of this information. And what I was after is sort of to help them think about how they look at information, how they think about information, and so they set about doing that. And one of the things that they always do when I ask them to do that is that they organize the information in categories. So they would put the 10 cards that have to do with obesity or any kind of medical or health issues under the category of health. Or they might put a bunch of cards on how people treat each other in relationships under family relationships. And of course, this is exactly what I would do if I was organizing the information. Now, I want you to hold on to that thought, that anecdote, and I'm going to return to it later because I think it becomes a way of understanding what I'm talking about. So anyway, so that exercise was successful, and I did a follow-up, which I'll tell you in a few minutes. So again, both of these courses were looking at ways in which we can make research writing interesting, both the creative nonfiction course and the first-year writing course. And one of the ways that Tom's book helped me think about that was that he helped me see the ways in which narrative solves the problem of exposition. So what is the problem of exposition? If we're after getting people to read our writing in a sustained way, if we want to keep them with us, then one of the problems in research-based writing is if you have long stretches of exposition, it gets less interesting, particularly if that information is heavily factual. And so one of the things that we tend to do to deal with that is that we tend to introduce narrative. And so Tom's book helped me to go back and look at a passage like this from Richard Conniff, a writer who I've admired for many, many years and whose essay, Why Did God Create Flies, I think appeared in the very first edition of The Curious Researcher. And it helped me to look at a passage like this in new ways. Now, I've been talking about the problem of exposition for decades, and I always had I always felt uncomfortable with the way I talked about it. It didn't seem it seemed rather superficial, so I'd say stuff like, you should look for opportunities to use lively prose, voicey prose, that you should look for analogy and comparison, blah, 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 blah. So I would always explain these things and imagine that it really had very little impact. But with Tom's book and his suggestion that there's deeper structures to narrative that we can work into exposition, I began to look at a passage like this, and I saw that, no, it's not just, there's an organizing logic behind using narrative to make exposition interesting. And so, this passage about flies by Richard Conniff is both wonderfully written and really pretty interesting. And so the question is, why is it interesting? And there is a narrative explanation for that. But let me back up a little bit and talk about what we mean by narrative. And I would say that there are 4 elements of narrative. The first is obvious, that narrative is always establishing some kind of relationship to time. The next is fairly obvious, and that is that it's always or often in relation to a particular place or space. Thirdly, there's a narrator for narrative. And finally, and I think this is less obvious, that that narrative, we typically think of narrative as just the way we tell stories, which is sequentially, then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Narrative is really a sense-making machine that we use story to help us understand the meaning of experience. And what we're looking for is not just sort of getting the order down, the chronology down, but we're looking for relationships. And the most important relationship we're looking for, I think, is causal. And I'll talk a little more about that in a second. So with this in mind, returning to Conniff's passage, I suddenly begin to see the sort of narrative signature all over the place. And so this is an essay that looks at asks the question why God created flies, and looks very closely at an experience he had sort of sitting in front of his beer glass one day and wondering what it was that fly was doing in front of him. And so you can see right here is a kind of a narrative moment. He places his meditation on the biology of the housefly in a particular moment in a particular place, so as I type. And then later we have a line like this, contemplating the sweetness of life. And so not only is this stylistically interesting, but it's also additional evidence that there's a narrator here, that there's a kind of guiding hand. We know that this is someone who is guiding us through the material. And part of the way we know that is this sense of him finding his own way of saying and seeing things. And then finally, the causal relationship. It's easy to overthink this, but I think basically when we're talking about the causal relationship and narrative, we're talking about something happens, we could call it an inciting incident, and that causes something else to happen. A beer lands on my beer glass, and Conniff asks, what's it doing and what does it have to do with me? And this is the sort of fundamental element of narrative. This is how narrative makes meaning, is identifying these causal relationships. So, for example, I feel guilty all the time. It's probably because I'm Catholic. That's the beginning of the story. So what I began to see then is that there are these sort of organizing structures that can be used in exposition that makes exposition interesting. And I began to apply that in my own work and in my own teaching. And so one of my assignments recently was to have students write about a writer who lived in the Boise Valley at the turn of the century, who was later an illustrator for Century Magazine and some of the great turn-of-the-century magazines. And I wanted them to write an essay about Mary Hallett Foote, but I also took them to the ruins of Foote's house, and so this becomes a narrative occasion that allows the students to take the research that they've done on the writer and build it into a narrative structure. And here you can see I've highlighted all these places in this passage where the writer is in fact using a narrative occasion as a framework for the exposition. And I think it works really great. It's just so much more interesting. But I started to think more about it, and I loved the way it helped me to see how narrative is an organizing structure for research writing and expository writing. But I began to think that there is something deeper going on here, that in fact there's a kind of narrative thinking or narrative reasoning that my students were using and that I use when I write essays. And that became really fascinating to me. And I began to look into that a little more closely. And this is one of the things that you encounter very quickly if you start looking into narrative reasoning, narrative logic, etc., is Jerome Bruner's notion of narrative versus paradigmatic thinking. Now, paradigmatic thinking, Bruner would argue, I think, is kind of scientific thinking, reasoning. It seeks, as he put it, seeks verifiable truth that is, quote, context-free and universal. Narrative thinking, on the other hand, he describes as a kind of reasoning that seeks explications that are context-sensitive and particular. Now, this sounds super abstract and maybe not all that interesting, but I think it becomes more interesting if we return to my fact cards. So let's just go back to that class. You recall that my students did what I would have done, given a bunch of cards on a whole bunch of topics and asked to organize them logically, is that they basically developed hierarchical categories. You know, one category could be relationships, the other might be environmental issues, health issues, and then organized the cards subordinately underneath them. This is an example of paradigmatic thinking. It is the kind of thinking that is most interested in developing conceptual relationships, relationships between ideas, ideas that are not necessarily bound in a particular context. And that's exactly what my students did. They used paradigmatic thinking, which is a dominant form of thinking. I'll talk about that in a minute or two, but that in school. And so after having thought about the sort of deeper power of narrative thinking, not just as a way of making writing interesting, I thought, well, here's an opportunity to see how that works. And so I told the students that very same day, after they had organized the cards and categories, that I wanted them to use a narrative logic for organizing the information. They didn't have to use all the cards, but they needed to use some of them using some logic that was inspired by narrative. And of course I shared with them, as I shared with you a few minutes ago, the four elements of narrative. And some really interesting things happen. Instead of organizing things by category, they began to play with chronology. So one group took a whole bunch of cards on the obesity epidemic in America and arranged that information chronologically. So suddenly they could see the development over time of this problem using these facts. Another group, and for years I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to get my students to cut across these categories and combine cards into different categories. And one group did that exactly. They saw a relationship, cause-effect relationship between air pollution facts and energy use facts and began to play around with that. So suddenly I was thinking that there's something really interesting going on here and something really powerful, because I was seeing on display this notion of narrative thinking and how it changes the way we see information. I walked out of that class that day thinking about a study that was done in the 70s about the Capelli tribesmen in Liberia. It was a study by a group of anthropologists, a fairly famous study actually, in which they asked, they presented tribal members with 20 items, and there were items that ranged from kitchen tools, gardening tools, fruits, vegetables, items of clothing. And they asked them, they asked the Capelli, organize these items in a way that makes sense to you. And what they did surprised everyone, and that is that they began to organize the material, the items, in functional rather than conceptual categories. So, for example, they put a knife with a potato. And so when the anthropologist said, well, why would you do that? And they said, well, you take a knife and you cut the potato. Now, our response to this exercise, Western response, paradigmatic response would be the categories, you know, put all the tools together, all the vegetables together, all the fruit together. And that was described when the tribesmen were asked, you know, how would you think about that as an organizing strategy? They thought only a fool would do that, which I found just hilarious and interesting. So there's this kind of cultural, this cultural dimension, I think, to narrative thinking that I found fascinating. And of course, this brings us to trying to think about how the place of narrative thinking in academic writing. And of course, as writing teachers, this is the thing that we're most interested in. And I think I think this is really this is where we start running into problems. There is, of course, a fair amount of academic writing in a range of disciplines that's very interested in narrative, and I'm thinking in particular, for example, of research that's based on case study or ethnography, and these are disciplines that are less interested in abstract reasoning and universal principles that can be stripped from context, and more interested in what context tells us about what's going on. In our own writing classes, I'm afraid that I think narrative gets sort of fenced off into creative writing courses and maybe an introduction to a genre that we give to students just because it's, and I'm making air quotes with my fingers, easier. On the other hand, the kind of reasoning that we encourage in our classes, I would say, is almost exclusively paradigmatic, which I think is epitomized by the kind of the deductive hierarchical expository writing that's again epitomized by the thesis-proof structure. So I began to think about this some more, and though I hate to make the Common Core guilty of yet another sin, I think, which can be way overstated, I think it's telling that in the Common Core, when we talk about language arts goals, what they say about argument and narrative. So argument is about analysis and reasoning, and narrative is merely a technique. And I think to some extent this distinction between seeing argument or paradigmatic thinking as deep reasoning and analysis and narrative as merely a technique is very telling, and one of the reasons which I think narrative thinking is de-emphasized to some extent in our pedagogies. So I found myself asking, you know, like, why is this so? Why has narrative thinking been marginalized, or why has narrative been reduced to a technique? And I think James Moffat, who many of you may know, was a wonderful theorist in composition studies, said something I've never forgotten. He said, "To abstract is to trade a loss of reality for a gain in control." One of the powerful things about paradigmatic thinking is that it involves abstraction which strips away the messiness and the complexity of context. And so one of the reasons I think we're drawn to a model of writing like the thesis-proof model is that it makes it makes it easier for our students to manage information for this very reason. I think there's another deeper reason too, and that's the scientific bias of our culture that's epitomized by Richard Dawkins' quote here, where he writes, "Science is the only way we know to understand the real world," which to me is a very narrow way of looking at how we understand the world. A philosopher, Mary Medley, had a wonderful rejoinder to this where she said, a toothache is as real as a tooth, which suggests that experience is in fact another way of knowing the world and a powerful way of knowing the world. Just to finish up here, so where does that leave me anyway? Obviously it leaves me as an advocate for narrative thinking, and it also, and this is where I often end up in these conversations, it leads me back to old Mr. Montagne. When I think about my own teaching and my own efforts to encourage narrative thinking, I always come back to this genre, the Montaignean essay, which is a wonderful vehicle and container for both writing about experience, narrative approaches in the most obvious ways, but also a wonderful mechanism for encouraging narrative thinking, narrative thought. And I can talk more about that later, but I see this as a wonderful and powerful alternative to the kind of abstract, paradigmatic thinking that we emphasize, and I would argue that this narrative approach is the kind of thinking that we should encourage, much more so than we do. So that's about it. I'm happy to talk now.
Thank you so much for that, Bruce. I'd like to open it up to the floor if anyone has questions for Bruce or comments. Feel free to type them into the little box and there in your dashboard. And while we're waiting on that to happen, maybe I'll ask a question. People are sending in their gratitude, Bruce. There's been a couple of thank yous. There's also been a couple of questions while you were in the midst of speaking about being able to access this information later, and I did express that we will be uploading the video to our Pedagogy and Practice archives. I believe that Steve gets that done fairly quickly, maybe within 48 hours, maybe even sooner than that. Before we close today, not that we're closing right this second, but Bruce, don't let me forget, maybe we can make sure that you pass along your email address and that sort of thing.
Sure, yeah.
All right, so here are some questions that are coming in. Are there particular essays by Montagne that you recommend for students?
You know, I don't think that I would recommend necessarily, particularly if we're talking about first-year writers. I'm not sure that I recommend Montagne because he's pretty challenging. He's really, after you read a few essays, you fall in love with him. My students tend to fall in love with him, but I think there's plenty of examples of essay writing that demonstrates narrative thinking. And for example, the piece that I mentioned early in my talk, the Conniff essay, Why God Created Flies, is a wonderful example of both a researched essay and also a example of the kind of narrative thinking I'm talking about. And so I think there's just a gazillion essayists out there who are doing this kind of thing. I think the Montagne essay that people tend to read most often and share most often that I think is probably most accessible to students is an essay called On Cannibals. And I think even first-year writing students would find this a really fascinating essay.
Great. Here's another question for you, Bruce. Do you have any particular answers for students who were intimidated by this new type of structure and this new way of thinking? That comes from Brenna Dugan.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I was talking to my students yesterday about this in one of my rhetoric classes. You know, that one of the things that draws students to the thesis-proof model is that it's a structure, or in its sort of extreme variation, the 5-paragraph theme, it's a sensible structure, and it's one that they can see and understand. And it's also one that's, as I've said, is consistent with the way they think about things. You know, that subordinating ideas makes a lot of sense to them, as it does to me. And I I would hasten to add that there's nothing wrong with the thesis-proof structure. In fact, that's an important thing to teach. But it is a particular way of thinking that I think is less comprehensive than we like to think it is. But anyway, when I talk about essaying, students immediately think that I'm talking about something that has no structure. And in fact, that's not true at all. And so students who are intimidated by the so-called structurelessness of essaying, I talk to them about how it all begins with motive. When we write analytical essays that are thesis-driven, we typically find an answer or a thesis as early as we can, and that becomes the organizing tool for the essay. But what if we start with questions instead of answers? That has deep implications for how we develop a piece of writing. So if we start with a question, usually the first part of the essay is to provide a context for where that question arose. And one of the ways I like to think about this is in a 3-act structure. So Act 1 is basically, trying to dramatize or illuminate where the writer's question came from, what context, what situation. Act 2 is basically the zigzag between sources trying to sort out what the answer might be to that question or what other questions arise, the complexities, the complications, even the contradictions. And then Act 3 is essentially, like any narrative arc, some kind of resolution, some kind of point of insight. So when I teach the essay, one of the things that I do is I teach a 3-act structure, and I ask students to try to think about their essays that way. And it seems to be really helpful for students who are intimidated about what they view as the sort of structureless nature of essay writing.
Thank you, Bruce. We have a few more questions for you. This one sort of connects to the last one. It's from Amanda Stewart, and she asked, how do we introduce the concept of narrator when teaching narrative thinking? And do you think that it's important that students understand that part of narrative, do you think it's important that students understand that part of narrative in more academic writing?
Thanks, Amanda. I do, and that's one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about. One of the insights I think that I got from Tom Newkirk's book is this idea of that all writing has a narrator. And I tell this to my students who are doing formal academic writing, more formal academic writing as well. And in fact, they never stop being narrators. Narrators aren't always first person, which is the way we always think of them. We usually think about them a narrator in literary terms. But in fact, there's always a narrator, that there's always a guiding hand. And so one of the things I think is so important in a first-year writing class is that by one way or another, and I think narrative thinking is a great way to do it, we need to reinforce the idea that no matter what, almost no matter what genre the students are working in, they are the narrator. They are the guiding hand. Though they may not talk about themselves, they may not use first person, they always have to give readers a sense that they're in control, that they're guiding us through the material. When we read something that seems to lack a narrator, that's when we bail. That's when we're not interested in a sustained reading. That's when we go eat candy, do something else.
Let's see if that was a great answer. I laughed out loud. I had myself on mute to save everyone from my cackling there. Jill Haney sends her gratitude. Thanks. And so did some other people earlier. I mean, the first like 10 messages that came in were just thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah. Well, some of these are my friends, so these are my plants.
Well, we do have a few more minutes for some other questions. If anybody who's still on the line wants to type in a question, that was all of the formal questions that we had. And while we give people a chance see that, Bruce. Let me just follow up and ask a question. It seems to me that it's kind of an assumption now that one of the best ways to ensure that students are going to be successful in college is to give them opportunities to be really flexible thinkers. And so I wondered if you might not talk just for a minute about how you feel that introducing this new way of thinking about writing helps students to develop new ways of thinking about, whatever challenges or issues or questions that they may have, academic or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I'm still working on the answer, to be honest with you. But first of all, I think naming the dominant kinds of thinking that schooling tends to encourage, which I believe is what Bruner called paradigmatic thinking, deductive thinking, where you're trying to sort out ideas based on a hierarchical relationship. I like to call it the Department of Homeland Security thinking, where there's a top guy and top person, and then everything else is subordinate to it. Identifying and naming that as a kind of thinking that is valuable, especially in certain writing situations, if we're talking about writing, and something that we should learn and practice. But that it is half of the bed, and that we need to make room in the bed for narrative thinking as an alternative, which I think is a powerful alternative, and one that students have, other than their personal experience as storytellers, have very little experience with in an academic context. And so, so part of my goal in teaching a class that introduces this is to sort of name and also celebrate paradigmatic thinking and its virtues as a really appropriate method of thought in a whole range of writing situations. And I think the classic example would be something like the essay exam. But then to suggest to them that if they experiment and play around with this alternative way of thinking, narrative thinking, which foregrounds context, which says essentially, I'm not going to barter away context to make abstraction easier. I'm going to indulge in the complexity of context, which involves contradiction, it involves questions, and that this is a really rich source of thinking, and that it is the kind of thinking that is most conducive to discovery. And so if partly what we're trying to teach is that writing and thinking is a means of discovery, and this is of course the inquiry argument, then I would argue that narrative thinking is a wonderful and powerful alternative that students have very little experience with, and that once they begin to practice, they'll find compelling.
Susan asked a follow-up question. She asked, how do you help your students who are afraid or hesitant to approach writing in this way? Especially, those students, and we've all had them, who've, had that sort of paradigmatic essay approach just hammered into them, and anytime they've ever deviated, this is me sort of improvising on Susan's question, but every time they've ever deviated from that 5-paragraph or at least that 3.5 sort of thesis-driven essay, they've been penalized, and so now they're in our classes and we're saying, all right, now we want you to try this new thing, and of course, naturally they're scared. So how do you help them to sort of come to this way of thinking?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and it's a really important question, and I think there are a lot of answers, and I suspect that there's a number of us here at this moment who have great thoughts about that. Here's one of the ways that I would begin, and that is to remind students that we're all storytellers. That, in fact, narrative thinking isn't alien. It's alien in school to some extent, but it isn't alien in experience in life. And in fact, it's a fundamental part of life. That narrative is the sense-making machine that we've used since we're old enough to kind of abstract from our experiences and contemplate and meditate on what they mean. And so that narrative thinking is not an alien idea, that in fact it's deeply ingrained in how we move through the world. So again, I think I would introduce the idea of narrative thinking by reminding them of how fundamental story is. And you know, you can create occasions for story in classes all the time. You know, and a great way to introduce it, I think, in the beginning of a writing class is the kind of thing, the get to know you exercises that we often do in classes, and in which you prompt students to tell a story of some turning point, say some turning point in their lives, and they start to engage with each other in a way that they're used to engaging, which is telling each other stories. And so it begins, I think, by reminding them of how fundamental this is to sense-making, to understanding our experience, and that, in fact, this notion of causality, finding reasons for why we feel or do the things we do, is exactly what it means to be human. It's part of being human. What they don't understand or haven't seen is the ways in which this is a powerful mode of thought in an academic environment as well. And so I think it starts by grounding them in their own experiences as storytellers, reminding them that it's such a fundamental way of knowing and making meaning, and then moving them slowly, as I did, beginning with those fact cards from the Harper's Index, towards seeing how that thinking changes the way they work and think about information and knowledge.
So we have a couple of folks asking what I think is maybe the elephant in the room question, which is, all right, great, so students are writing, using this narrative approach in comp, but what happens when they go to their other classes? I mean, don't we know, for example, John Wallace wonders that in business and in science, students are encouraged to sort of write in that kind of neutral, non-opinionated narrative voice. And Susan sort of followed up by asking, okay, great, are students embracing this as something that transfers to other academic writing and other disciplines, or is this just something special they get to do for you?
Yeah, well, that is the elephant in the room, and that's a really important question, and I think there's a lot of answers to that. First, I would point out, and I mentioned this briefly in my talk, that narrative thinking is not entirely alien to academic disciplines. And I'm thinking, for example, of business, nursing, sociology, anthropology. These are all disciplines that are interested in research into particular contexts, particular cultures, in particular times and places. And so that, in fact, narrative thinking and narrative approaches are fundamentally a part of a number of academic disciplines. And that students will have an opportunity, hopefully have an opportunity, to use research methods that exploit that. I would also say that that certain elements of this can be harvested for even conventional academic writing. And one of the things that I mentioned a minute ago is this notion of narrator. So if we give students a chance to be the narrators of their own work and their own thinking in our first-year writing classes, and we reinforce the idea that this isn't just writing about yourself, that this just isn't the deployment of the first person, but it is in fact learning to manage and control a reader's experience of your text, then this is a powerful idea that they can use in a whole range of genres and a whole range of writing situations. And so that alone, that experience of being a narrator in the broadest sense, I think is a really powerful thing that they can export from our classes. And then finally, I would argue that part of what we're teaching in narrative thinking both is the importance of context and understanding how the world works, but also introducing them to a method of discovering ideas, of figuring out what they think. And of course, this is one of the things we teach in writing classes. The right to learn pedagogy is extremely powerful for students. So put simply, narrative thinking is a way of discovering a thesis. it's a way of, I think, an alternative way of discovering a thesis. It's question-driven, which I think is much more like the kind of scholarly work that we want them to do.
So to build on that, then, this is a question coming from, I don't know if it's Robley or Robley, and I'm sorry, Robley. But Robley writes, it sounds as though you rely on this concept of causality to help guide students to think and to ask questions. So what other techniques do you use to sort of encourage that inquiry and get students asking the right questions, questions that, that hopefully they don't yet know the answers to?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's a really important one because I think the art of asking questions, of knowing which questions are good questions and which ones aren't, is something we can't teach too much. And it's anecdotally, and I think there's also some research evidence suggests that students struggle with this idea of what a good question is terribly. And so it's a really important thing to talk about. And I spent a fair amount of time in my own classes exploring what a good question is. And I think it begins by teaching students the value and the power of suspending judgment. Paradigmatic thinking, I think, tends to push students towards coming to conclusions too quickly. In some writing situations, that's a really smart idea. But there's a number of writing situations, including a lot of ones in our classes, where it's not necessarily a good idea, because they may latch on an idea that they're not particularly interested in or seems obvious or even cliched. And so part of the art of asking questions is seeing the power of suspending judgment and what happens when you do. And there's just so many ways to do that. The one that's probably I've used most over the years is the myth of the boring topic, which is in The Curious Researcher, I think, in which you give students a sort of ordinary topic or ordinary object. It could be a banana, say, or a pencil and a rock, and then you have them generate a list of questions about it. And so what happens is that they generate 60 questions about an object that they could name and very quickly and just shut down the inquiry altogether. But they indulge me and they go on for about 15 minutes and they generate a lot of questions. And so you have this raw data of questions that you can look at, and then you can begin to explore what makes a good question and what doesn't. And that's something that I've spent a fair amount of time trying to see the ways in which, what are the qualities of a good question and what aren't. And there are all sorts of other ways to do that. It's really interesting. In the English department, we share our space with art, which I love because I get to walk down the hallways and see the photography exhibits on the way to my office. And there was this great exercise that one of the photography professors had posted, and the exercise was called Sitting Tight. And what this instructor asks students to do is to take their cameras and sit in one place and take as many pictures as they could of everything around them, and they couldn't move. And what happens is what usually happens when you look closely at something and you suspend judgment, is that they saw so much more than they expected to see. And these are the kinds of experiences that I think we want to have to build into our courses that lead, I think, both to seeing the power of suspending judgment and then also seeing the ways in which that can lead to questions that can sustain inquiry over time.
This has just been amazing. I feel, as I always do every time I hear you speak, just sort of invigorated and excited about. I'm not kidding. I'm always inspired to write after I've spent a few minutes with you, and so I just want to thank you for that. I'm sure that all of the people who joined us today feel the same way. We have exactly 1 minute left. We're not going to get through all the questions, but let me let you have the last word as we close out here. Tell us when you're going to be presenting at 4Cs. Tell us where we can read more about this presentation, the ideas that you presented here. Tell us how we can contact you.
Well, I finally got a proposal accepted at 4Cs after whiffing it like the three last year. So of course, they put me on Saturday afternoons, so I'll be on Saturday afternoon, and I'll be talking about this, actually, in a tribute to Tom Newkirk. and I'm looking forward to that. And so in terms of, this is a fairly new area of inquiry for me, and I've drafted an article on this, and I will continue to pursue it, and in the meantime, what work I've done on it will be put up on my website, bruceballenger.com.
And some people email you through the website if they want to quiz you more.
Sure.
Great, because there are a few more questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions today, but I want to thank everyone for asking such good questions, too. And those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, I will be forwarding them to Bruce so that he can reach out to you. And again, just thank you so much for participating. The webinar will be up on our Pedagogy and Practice website, along with all of our other archives. You can go there and check out Bruce's other webinars that he's done for us in the past. And do stop by the Pearson booth at 4 Cs. I'm hoping to get Bruce there for at least a minute or two. Yeah, all right. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. You have a great day.